66 million years ago, the Cretaceous period closed with an impact so violent that it erased nearly 3/4 of life on Earth. The asteroid that struck near what is today Chicxulub on the Yucatán Peninsula was estimated at between 10 and 12 kilometers in diameter, traveling at more than 20 kilometers per second. The energy released has been calculated at over 100 teratons of TNT, vastly exceeding the combined output of all nuclear weapons ever built. Geological evidence, including a layer of iridium-rich clay first identified in 1980 by Luis and Walter Alvarez at Gubbio, Italy, points directly to this singular catastrophe. The rare element iridium, far more abundant in asteroids than in Earth's crust, formed a global signature marking the instant of devastation. At the moment of impact, the atmosphere ignited. Rock vaporized into plasma, ejecting molten droplets that circled the globe before raining down in sheets of incandescent glass. These spherules, found in deposits from North America to Europe, testify to the firestorm that followed. Heat pulses, lasting only minutes, were sufficient to ignite entire forests. Fossilized charcoal deposits in Cretaceous sediments record a planet-wide conflagration. Temperatures on the ground may have briefly reached several hundred degrees Celsius, enough to sear exposed organisms instantly. The blast excavated a crater more than 180 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. Shocked quartz, microtectites, and tsunami deposits stretching as far inland as North Dakota corroborate the violence of the event. Seismic energy triggered earthquakes estimated at magnitude 11, far beyond anything in recorded history, while oceanic displacement launched waves hundreds of meters high across the Gulf of Mexico and beyond. In the aftermath, volcanic activity may have been amplified, but it was the atmospheric changes that proved decisive. Soot and pulverized rock particles lofted into the stratosphere created a global veil. Computer models run by scientists such as James Casting and David Toon suggest a dramatic reduction in sunlight, cutting photosynthesis nearly to zero for months, possibly years. Average surface temperatures plummeted by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. This so-called impact winter crippled primary production, collapsing food chains from plankton in the oceans to vegetation on land. Isotopic studies of foraminifera in deep-sea cores reveal sudden and catastrophic declines in marine ecosystems precisely at this boundary. 4 dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years, the sequence was terminal. Large herbivores such as hadrosaurs and ceratopsians required vast quantities of plant matter that no longer regenerated in sufficient volume. Apex predators such as Tyrannosaurus rex, dependent on these herbivores, starved soon after. Fossil records indicate a precipitous drop in dinosaur diversity within a geological blink. While some lineages of birds, the only surviving dinosaurs, managed to persist by feeding opportunistically, their larger relatives vanished. The broad atoll extended beyond dinosaurs. Ammonites, marine reptiles like mosasaurs, and many groups of plankton disappeared entirely. In total, approximately 75% of all species ceased to exist. The K-PG boundary marks one of the 5 great mass extinctions in Earth's history, rivaling the Permian-Triassic catastrophe 252 million years earlier. Yet it was unique in being so sudden, an extinction event traceable to a single day of impact, though its cascading consequences unfolded for years afterward. Paleontologists continue to uncover fossils that capture this moment of planetary collapse. In 2019, Robert De Palma reported discoveries at the Tanis site in North Dakota, where fish and plants were buried by a surge of water and debris carrying impact spherules that lodged in their gills. Such deposits suggest that seismic waves and atmospheric disturbances arrived within hours of the asteroid strike, leaving a precise record of biotic trauma. The immediacy of these findings reinforces the view that this extinction was not gradual but instantaneous at geological scale. Had the asteroid missed Earth by even a small fraction of orbital timing, the entire trajectory of evolution would have unfolded differently. Dinosaurs, at their zenith in diversity and ecological range, showed no signs of decline before the impact. Sauropods grazed across South America and Asia, hadrosaurs proliferated in North America, and raptors were spreading into multiple niches. Mammals remained small, often nocturnal creatures, adapted to the margins rather than the centers of ecosystems. Without the sudden disruption of global climate and vegetation, the balance of dominance would have remained firmly with the archosaurs. The Chicxulub impact was not merely an accident of celestial mechanics. It was the selective filter through which the lineage leading to primates, and eventually humans, could emerge. Without it, the adaptive radiation of mammals in the Paleogene would never have occurred in the same way. This extinction thus represents both an end and a beginning, the closing of the Mesozoic and the opening of the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. Yet the counterfactual scenario, what if this asteroid had never collided with Earth, remains one of the most compelling questions in evolutionary science. It forces a confrontation not only with the contingency of human origins, but with the alternative ecologies that might have developed under uninterrupted dinosaurian rule. The fossil record speaks of absence, voids where entire clades once thrived. But to imagine the absence of absence, to imagine continuity instead of erasure, is to consider a world in which the great extinction never took place, where dinosaurs advanced into niches denied to them by chance, and where mammals never rose beyond obscurity. From this vantage, one must look backward into the Cretaceous not as an age of ending, but as an age poised on the edge of possibilities that were never realized. The late Cretaceous world was not a landscape awaiting collapse, but one of extraordinary vitality. Across every continent, dinosaurs occupied an array of ecological roles that reflected their evolutionary success. Fossil assemblages from formations such as the Hell Creek in North America, the Nemegt Basin in Mongolia, and the Mavorano of Madagascar illustrate how extensively these reptiles had diversified. Herbivores of immense scale coexisted with predatory specialists, their interactions shaping entire ecosystems through predation, competition, and environmental modification. Ceratopsians, with their elaborate frills and horns, dominated many northern hemisphere ecosystems. Triceratops horridus, known from numerous specimens across the American West, achieved lengths of 9 meters and weights exceeding 6 tons. Their skulls, among the largest of any land animal, bore structures whose function has been debated for decades. Peter Dodson and later Andrew Fark examined evidence suggesting that frill morphology was not simply defensive, but may have served roles in sexual display and species recognition, paralleling how antlers operate in cervids. Herd behavior is indicated by bone bed discoveries at sites such as the Judith River Formation, where dozens of individuals were preserved together, implying complex social structures that could repel predators through sheer numbers. Parallel to them were hadrosaurs, the duck-billed herbivores, whose fossilized remains are among the most abundant of any dinosaur group. Lambeosaurines such as Corythosaurus and Parasaurolophus evolved resonant crests that functioned as sound chambers. Computer modeling of their nasal passages by David Weishampel in the 1990s demonstrated that these structures could generate low-frequency calls capable of traveling long distances, perhaps coordinating herd movement across floodplains. Enamel microstructure studies reveal grinding surfaces adapted for processing fibrous plants, suggesting that hadrosaurs exploited a wide dietary niche that sustained immense populations. Trackways in Alberta show herds composed of adults and juveniles moving together, a sign of coordinated parental care. At the opposite end of the spectrum stood the sauropods, enduring representatives of a lineage stretching back to the Jurassic. Titanosaurs in South America, such as Argentinosaurus and Dreadnoughtus, reached estimated lengths of over 30 meters and masses of more than 60 metric tons. Their vertebral architecture, studied through CT scanning by Matt Waddell, shows a complex system of air sacs that lightened their skeletons and aided in respiratory efficiency. The presence of titanosaurs in regions ranging from Patagonia to Africa illustrates a global distribution that persisted into the late Cretaceous despite continental drift. Their grazing capacity reshaped vegetation, preventing forests from maturing fully in some regions and promoting open habitats that favored fast-moving herbivores. Predatory guilds mirrored this herbivorous abundance. Tyrannosaurids represented the pinnacle of large-bodied carnivores in North America and Asia. Tyrannosaurus rex, with a skull over 1.5 meters in length, possessed bite forces estimated at more than 35,000 newtons, measured through finite element analysis conducted by Gregory Erickson and colleagues. Their teeth, banana-shaped and serrated, were designed not only to pierce flesh but also to crush bone, enabling them to access marrow unavailable to many other predators. Trackways reveal that tyrannosaurs hunted in regions where ceratopsians and hadrosaurs concentrated, positioning themselves as apex regulators of population balance. Alongside these giants were the dromaeosaurs, smaller but highly specialized hunters. Velociraptor mongoliensis, recovered from the Jadokta Formation of Mongolia, rarely exceeded 2 meters in length, yet its sickle-shaped claws and evidence of pack behavior suggest an ecological strategy based on agility and intelligence. The famous fighting dinosaurs specimen, in which a velociraptor is preserved locked in combat with a protoceratops, captures their predatory tenacity. Endocasts of their cranial cavities reveal relatively enlarged forebrains compared to other reptiles, pointing toward advanced sensory integration. This trend foreshadowed avian cognition, and it positioned dromaeosaurs as predators relying on coordinated tactics rather than brute force. Herbivorous diversity was not restricted to the north. In the southern continents, abelisaurids emerged as formidable predators distinct from tyrannosaurs. Carnotaurus sastrii, excavated in Argentina in 1985 by José Bonaparte, displayed reduced forelimbs even more extreme than those of tyrannosaurids, but compensated with powerful hindlimbs and a rigid skull suited for rapid strikes. Their coexistence with titanosaur herds demonstrates the breadth of predator-prey dynamics across Gondwanan ecosystems. Meanwhile, ankylosaurs, with their armored plates and tail clubs, occupied defensive niches, resisting even the most determined assaults. These heavily armored herbivores left evidence of healed bite marks, suggesting that their defenses were often effective in deterring predators. The ecological web extended into the skies and seas. Pterosaurs such as Quetzalcoatlus reached wingspans exceeding 10 meters, patrolling coastlines and inland environments alike. Although avian dinosaurs were proliferating, these enormous flyers still held command over many aerial niches. In the oceans, mosasaurs and plesiosaurs dominated, though their fates would also be tied to the terrestrial extinction. Together, these systems illustrate a biosphere in which archosaurs occupied nearly every available role, leaving little ecological space for mammals beyond burrowing, nocturnal, and insectivorous habits. Climate during the Maastrichtian stage was warm, with global temperatures significantly higher than today and no permanent ice caps. Fossilized flora from high latitudes, including metasequoia and ginkgo, remains discovered in Arctic Canada, demonstrate that polar regions supported forests where dinosaurs adapted to months-long light and dark cycles. Growth rings in the bones of hadrosaurs unearthed in Alaska suggest seasonal physiological changes, indicating complex adaptations to extreme environments. The absence of a catastrophic climatic downturn at this time is corroborated by stable isotope analyses of marine sediments, pointing to continuity rather than instability in ecological conditions. Taken together, the evidence depicts a world not in decline but at its ecological peak. Dinosaur diversity, in terms of both species richness and ecological strategies, shows no statistical sign of reduction prior to the impact. Studies led by Stephen Bruzat and Richard Butler in the early 2010s employed Bayesian analyses of fossil occurrence data, concluding that most major clades were maintaining or even expanding their ranges. If environmental stability had continued, evolutionary trajectories were poised to generate further specialization, with lineages already displaying signs of innovation in diet, locomotion, and cognition. The fossil record preserves only fragments of this flourishing biosphere, yet each new discovery underscores the scale of evolutionary momentum at that moment. The unresolved question is not whether dinosaurs were declining, but how far their potential might have extended had nothing interrupted the course of their adaptive radiation. Every specimen that captures growth patterns, social behavior, or dietary strategy adds another thread to a picture of an evolutionary experiment still unfolding, one that might have produced outcomes unrecognizable compared to the Cenozoic world that followed. Beneath the immense shadow of the dinosaurs, mammals occupied an evolutionary position of marginal importance. Fossil evidence from late Cretaceous deposits demonstrates that they had diversified into several lineages, but their body sizes, ecological strategies, and reproductive capacities remained constrained by the dominance of reptilian megafauna. The largest known mammals of this era, such as Repenomamus robustus from the Ischian Formation in China, reached little more than 1 meter in length and perhaps 10 to 12 kilograms in mass. Even this predator, capable of consuming juvenile dinosaurs as stomach contents reveal, remained exceptional rather than representative of the group. Most late Cretaceous mammals were insectivorous or omnivorous generalists. Multituberculates, one of the longest-lived mammalian clades, developed gnawing incisors reminiscent of later rodents and complex molars with multiple cusps for grinding vegetation. Yet their body plans show clear adaptations to arboreal or burrowing niches, not open habitats where large herbivores and predators competed. Marsupial relatives such as Alphodon, preserved in the Hell Creek and Lance formations, remained small and opportunistic, producing tiny litters that matured rapidly but seldom achieved longevity in predator-rich environments. Placental precursors such as Protungulatum, a diminutive insectivore, appeared in the fossil record just before the boundary, but their adaptive range remained narrow. The ecological marginality of mammals during this period can be measured not only in their physical size, but also in their temporal activity patterns. Fossil scleral ring data, combined with reconstructions of retinal morphology, suggest that many early mammals were nocturnal. Barbara Crompton and colleagues demonstrated that the evolutionary trajectory of mammalian visual systems, large optic lobes and rods, corresponds with low-light specialization. This nocturnal bottleneck hypothesis explains why most mammals of the late Mesozoic avoided daylight hours, ceding diurnal activity to dinosaurs. Such constraints limited access to resources, leaving only insects, small vertebrates, and detritus as reliable food sources. Reproductive biology further constrained expansion. Compared to reptiles, mammals invested heavily in fewer offspring, requiring lactation and extended parental care. While advantageous in stable niches, this strategy reduced their capacity to expand population numbers in environments dominated by rapid predation turnover. Small litter sizes and prolonged juvenile dependence meant that mammalian populations could be suppressed with relative ease, never achieving the explosive abundance seen in dinosaur herbivores or in later rodents of the Cenozoic. Even in cases where mammals displayed ecological innovation, opportunities were limited. The discovery of Docofossa, a fossorial mammal from the Jurassic of China, indicates that mammals had already evolved specializations akin to modern moles, but these remained isolated adaptations rather than transformative trends. Mammals experimented with gliding, burrowing, and aquatic habits, yet each remained constrained to small-scale environments. They lacked the capacity to exert influence on vegetation, large prey populations, or atmospheric processes, which dinosaurs regularly shaped through their biomass and behaviors. Competition with reptiles extended into niches that mammals might otherwise have occupied. Crocodiliforms thrived along river systems, seizing aquatic and semi-aquatic roles that mammals would only later claim. Pterosaurs and early birds dominated aerial insectivory, displacing mammals from flighted opportunities. Even scavenging roles, sometimes hypothesized as mammalian opportunities, were often monopolized by small theropods such as Truden, whose keen senses and speed rendered them efficient at exploiting carcasses. This left mammals structurally locked into subordinate niches, unable to breach the ecological monopoly established by archosaurs. The consequence was an evolutionary stalemate. Molecular clock analyses performed by Chicxulub and Maureen O'Leary suggest that many lineages of modern placentals diverged well before the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, but their genetic potential did not translate into ecological expansion. Instead, lineages remained cryptic, waiting under environmental constraints that prevented visible radiation. This disconnect between molecular divergence and morphological stasis illustrates how evolutionary potential can remain dormant when ecological opportunities are blocked. If conditions had remained stable, the probability of mammals rising beyond small-bodied insectivores appears exceedingly low. Predation pressure from theropods, competition from reptiles in aquatic and aerial habitats, and exclusion from large herbivory left no unoccupied ecological space. Fossil assemblages consistently reveal mammals only in low relative abundance compared to dinosaurs, seldom exceeding a few % of recovered vertebrate specimens. Their persistence was based not on dominance but on resilience. Burrows, nocturnal activity, and generalized diets insulated them from extinction risks without enabling expansion. The broader evolutionary implications are stark. Without ecological release, traits central to human emergence, large brains, dexterous hands, social complexity, would have remained improbable developments. The metabolic demands of encephalization require access to calorie-rich diets that small-bodied insectivores cannot secure in abundance. Energetic surplus, necessary for prolonged juvenile development and cultural learning, was absent from mammalian life histories in the Cretaceous context. If dinosaurs had retained dominance, primates as we know them could not have arisen, and the evolutionary trajectory of intelligence would have required a completely different lineage. Fossilized mammal tracks, burrow systems, and dental microwear studies provide glimpses into this constrained existence. Yet each line of evidence underscores the same theme. Mammals were survivors, not architects, of Mesozoic ecosystems. Their strategies emphasized concealment, opportunism, and reproductive persistence rather than ecological transformation. Evolutionary radiation requires both potential and opportunity. During the age of dinosaurs, only the first existed in mammals. The second was locked behind ecological walls erected by creatures far larger, faster, and more specialized. The persistence of these limitations raises a critical question. If evolutionary release never arrived, what avenues remained for mammalian lineages? Could subtle adaptations within their limited niches have produced unexpected pathways, or would every potential innovation have been suppressed beneath the weight of reptilian supremacy? The conditions under which change might have become possible remain open to inquiry, pointing toward the uncharted evolutionary possibilities that lay dormant beneath the canopy of dinosaurian dominance. If the catastrophic asteroid had never arrived, the lineages of dinosaurs already established in the late Cretaceous would have continued their trajectories of innovation. Evolutionary momentum was not slowing. Fossil discoveries across Asia, North America, and South America point to adaptive experimentation occurring within multiple groups. These were not static organisms locked in fixed ecological roles, but lineages undergoing constant modification in morphology, behavior, and physiology. The fossil record from formations such as Nemegt, Horseshoe Canyon, and Morelia reveals that the Cretaceous landscape was a crucible of evolutionary novelty. Among theropods, encephalization was a discernible trend. Trudontids and dromaeosaurs displayed cranial capacities that scaled disproportionately relative to their body sizes compared to earlier theropods. The cranial endocasts of Trudon formosus, analyzed by Dale Russell in the 1970s, revealed an encephalization quotient far above that of typical reptiles and approaching levels seen in some modern birds. The complexity of their inner ear structures, which regulated balance and spatial orientation, suggests advanced predatory coordination. Pack hunting, inferred from multiple fossil trackways, would have magnified these cognitive abilities into group-level strategies. In a world without interruption, these evolutionary pressures could have propelled theropods toward even higher neurological sophistication. Feather evolution provided another vector of innovation. Fossils from Liaoning in China, such as Sinosauropteryx and Caudipteryx, demonstrated that feathers were not restricted to flight but had diversified functions including thermoregulation, display, and brooding. The discovery of pigment-containing melanosomes in Anchiornis specimens allowed Jacob Vinther and colleagues to reconstruct coloration, revealing patterns useful for communication and camouflage. If these trends had continued, visual signaling could have become increasingly central to social and reproductive dynamics. Feather complexity, coupled with expanding neural capacities, set the stage for intricate behavioral repertoires that might have paralleled or even exceeded those of later birds. Sauropods, long thought to represent evolutionary limits of gigantism, were also undergoing refinements. Titanosaurs, dominant in South America, had evolved columnar limb postures and pneumatic vertebrae that optimized weight distribution. Gregory Paul and Michael Waddell's studies of skeletal reconstructions indicate that respiratory efficiency improved as air sac systems expanded. These modifications reduced metabolic costs of sustaining immense body sizes, creating a sustainable equilibrium between mass and physiology. Continuation of these trends might have opened new niches for sauropods, potentially adapting to more varied habitats, including highland regions where their predecessors had seldom ventured. Ornithischians were experimenting with social communication on an unprecedented scale. The elaborate cranial crests of Lambeosaurines, already capable of producing low-frequency resonances, were diversifying rapidly. Finite element analysis of Parasaurolophus crests by David Evans suggested structural modifications capable of producing distinct acoustic signatures between species. This acoustic partitioning hints at selective pressures favoring complex auditory landscapes, where herds could maintain cohesion in increasingly dense environments. If pursued further, one might expect the emergence of hierarchically organized herds with communication systems approaching the complexity of cetaceans or primates. Ceratopsians, too, were entering an arms race of morphology. Recent discoveries of species such as Cosmoceratops and Utaceratops from the Kai-Parawitz Formation reveal skull ornamentation far more elaborate than that of Triceratops. Each new form carried unique combinations of horns, frills, and bosses, suggesting rapid evolutionary turnover driven by sexual selection. Peter Makovicky's comparative studies argue that these structures evolved faster than functional explanations could account for, highlighting the intensity of social pressures. A continuation of this process might have pushed ceratopsians into extremes of cranial architecture, where display value outweighed defensive function, reshaping social dynamics within large herds. Predator-prey interactions ensured that no lineage could evolve in isolation. Tyrannosaurids refined their biomechanics in response to increasingly formidable herbivores. Analysis of leg proportions in juvenile T. rex specimens shows adaptations for speed, suggesting ontogenetic niche partitioning. Younger individuals hunted smaller prey while adults dominated megaherbivores. This life history strategy optimized survival across age classes, ensuring persistent selective pressure on prey species. Continued escalation would likely have sharpened both defensive and offensive strategies, locking predators and prey into cycles of evolutionary intensification. Environmental changes provided additional evolutionary stimulus. As continents drifted, new seaways and mountain chains fragmented populations, isolating gene pools. The western interior seaway divided North America into two landmasses, Laramidia and Appalachia, producing distinct faunal assemblages. In South America, isolation fostered endemic titanosaur diversity, while in Asia, the expansion of arid environments drove adaptations among theropods for more efficient water conservation. Each of these geographic experiments created unique evolutionary laboratories. Absent extinction, The accumulation of isolated lineages would have generated a kaleidoscope of specialized dinosaurs, many with no analogues in the present day. Behavioral evidence suggests that some lineages were moving toward increasing parental investment. Oviraptorid nests from Mongolia, preserved with adults brooding in bird-like postures, reveal sophisticated incubation strategies. The geometry of eggs, studied by Kohei Tanaka, shows adaptations for gas exchange consistent with controlled nesting environments. These reproductive strategies indicate selective pressures favoring care over quantity, a pathway that could have supported the evolution of more complex social systems. If extended, such dynamics might have laid foundations for cooperative breeding or communal nesting, behaviors that in mammals and birds have strong correlations with social cognition. The question of intelligence has long hovered around certain theropods. Dale Russell's speculative dinosauroid model, proposed in 1982, suggested that had trudontids continued to evolve unchecked, they might have achieved humanoid levels of intelligence. While criticized for anthropocentric assumptions, the underlying observation remains significant. Relative brain size and sensory complexity were already rising. Evidence of stereoscopic vision, acute olfaction, and advanced motor control hints at potential for increasingly flexible behavior. Uninterrupted evolutionary timescales measured in tens of millions of years would have provided ample opportunity for such traits to compound. The continuation of dinosaur evolution was not a static projection, but a dynamic process driven by climate, competition, geography, and social interaction. Each adaptive step opened further possibilities, while each constraint pushed lineages toward novel solutions. The direction of such trajectories cannot be forecast with precision, but the evidence leaves little doubt that the path ahead was branching, multifaceted, and unfinished. Evolutionary experiments were underway, and without interruption, their outcomes would have shaped ecosystems in ways still difficult to fully anticipate. The ecological scaffolding of the late Cretaceous world rested upon the immense bodies of herbivorous dinosaurs. Their presence dictated vegetation patterns, nutrient cycling, and even atmospheric composition. The scale of consumption by these animals was unparalleled. A single adult sauropod, weighing upward of 40 metric tons, required an estimated several hundred kilograms of plant matter daily. Herds numbering in the dozens, and in some regions possibly hundreds, transformed entire landscapes through constant grazing and browsing. Paleobotanical studies of fossilized leaf damage in the Hell Creek Formation indicate that hadrosaurs fed across wide plant spectra, stripping foliage from angiosperms, conifers, and ferns alike. Microscopic wear on their dental batteries, analyzed under scanning electron microscopy, shows distinct striations consistent with a grinding action, allowing efficient processing of fibrous plant tissues. Unlike mammals, whose molars must be replaced continuously through generations, hadrosaurs maintained multiple replacement teeth stacked within each socket, creating self-renewing shearing surfaces. This adaptation enabled uninterrupted feeding over long lifespans, exerting relentless pressure on plant communities. Sauropods reshaped ecosystems in different ways. Their long necks extended foraging height to several meters above ground, targeting foliage inaccessible to most other herbivores. Carbon isotope ratios in tooth enamel from titanosaur fossils in Patagonia reveal selective feeding at canopy levels, distinguishing them from contemporaneous hadrosaurs grazing nearer to the ground. The result was vertical partitioning of vegetation, where different herbivores minimized direct competition by exploiting separate layers of plant life. This stratification resembles the modern relationship between giraffes and antelopes in African savannas, but scaled to magnitudes far beyond any present system. The evolutionary response of plants to such constant pressure is written into their anatomy. Angiosperms, which spread rapidly during the Cretaceous, developed traits associated with defense against browsing, tougher leaves, rapid regrowth strategies, and in some cases, secondary metabolites with deterrent properties. Fossilized leaves with distinctive margins, preserved in deposits from Wyoming and Montana, display spines and thickened cuticles coinciding with the presence of large herbivore assemblages. Chemical analysis of fossil resins indicates elevated terpene levels, compounds that in modern plants function as anti-herbivory deterrents. These changes suggest coevolutionary dynamics, where plants adapted to resist or tolerate the relentless feeding of enormous dinosaurs. The constant movement of herds across landscapes also influenced soil and hydrological systems. The weight of sauropods compacted floodplains, altering drainage patterns and redirecting seasonal water flows. Trackway evidence in the Broome Sandstone of Western Australia records extensive trampling surfaces where repeated passage of herds created hardened ground that resisted erosion. Such modifications would have changed sediment deposition downstream, shaping the course of rivers and wetlands. In this sense, herbivores were geologic as well as biological agents. Nutrient cycling was equally significant. Coprolites attributed to titanosaurid sauropods contain large quantities of unprocessed plant matter, including fragments of cycads and conifers. Their digestive systems, although aided by massive gut volumes and likely microbial symbionts, did not fully break down lignin-rich tissues. The result was the redistribution of partially digested material across landscapes, fertilizing soils and promoting plant regeneration. This constant flux of nutrients parallels the role of elephants in modern ecosystems, though on a scale that magnified both the benefits and the destructive pressures. The social dynamics of herbivorous dinosaurs amplified their ecological influence. Bone beds from hadrosaur localities, such as the extensive accumulation at Pipestone Creek in Alberta, suggest herd structures numbering into the thousands. Large-scale herd movement would have stripped vegetation across wide swaths, creating temporary barren zones that only recovered after migration. In turn, these disturbances created mosaic landscapes of different successional stages, sustaining diverse communities of plants and smaller animals. The patchwork of habitats promoted by herbivore activity may have been a key factor in maintaining high biodiversity across Cretaceous ecosystems. The reproductive strategies of herbivores reinforced this cycle. Fossilized nesting grounds in Orcomahuevo, Argentina, preserve titanosaur eggs arranged in clustered patterns, indicating colonial nesting. Thousands of eggs deposited in shallow pits within limited areas suggest a strategy of overwhelming predation pressure through sheer numbers. As hatchlings emerged, their feeding patterns added another layer of ecological impact, consuming low-level vegetation in regions already reshaped by adults. Growth ring studies in juvenile bones indicate rapid growth rates, with young sauropods doubling their mass in just a few years. This accelerated development created an ongoing gradient of feeding pressures, from hatchlings clearing ground-level plants to adults stripping canopies. Hadrosaurs displayed different strategies. Nests containing juveniles of varying sizes, discovered in Montana, point to extended parental care. Such behavior implies that offspring remained near nesting grounds for significant periods, intensifying local grazing pressure. The resulting cycles of localized overgrazing may have driven plants toward faster regeneration strategies, favoring species with high growth rates over those with slower reproductive cycles. This evolutionary filter, shaped by herbivore feeding, may explain the rapid spread of angiosperms during the Cretaceous. The sheer scale of biomass tied up in herbivores also had atmospheric consequences. Respiration from countless individuals, coupled with microbial decomposition of their waste, produced vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane. Studies by David Wilkinson and Graham Ruxton estimated that sauropods alone could have generated hundreds of millions of tons of methane annually, potentially influencing global temperatures. While exact figures remain debated, isotopic evidence from marine sediments indicates fluctuating greenhouse gas concentrations coinciding with herbivore-dominated ecosystems. If dinosaur lineages had persisted, such biogenic gas cycles would have remained a dominant force in shaping Earth's climate. The interaction between herbivores and vegetation was neither static nor one-sided. Each grazing event, each trampling herd, and each nesting colony fed back into the evolutionary pathways of plants and soils. The landscapes of the Cretaceous were not passive backdrops, but dynamic systems in which mega-herbivores acted as keystone engineers. Their influence extended from microscopic symbionts in their guts to the composition of the atmosphere itself. The unresolved dimension lies in how far these pressures could have reshaped terrestrial ecosystems over tens of millions of uninterrupted years. Would plants have evolved further defenses, driving herbivores toward increasingly specialized feeding strategies, or would new forms of mutualism have emerged, stabilizing the cycle? The direction of these dynamics remains open, pointing toward ecological pathways that might have carried both plants and dinosaurs into uncharted evolutionary terrain. The dominance of giant herbivores was inseparable from the predators that tracked and shaped their populations. Apex carnivores in the late Cretaceous displayed a spectrum of adaptations, from bone-crushing jaws to coordinated hunting strategies, each contributing to a balance that maintained ecological tension across continents. If the cycle of evolutionary arms races had not been interrupted, predators would have continued to refine their capacities in response to herbivore defenses, ensuring a world where carnivory remained a central evolutionary force. The tyrannosaurids embodied the apex predator role in the northern hemisphere. Their skull architecture was a biomechanical marvel, combining reinforced cranial sutures with expanded muscle attachment sites that allowed extreme bite forces. Finite element analysis of Tyrannosaurus rex specimens has revealed stress distribution patterns consistent with bone splintering power, an ability unique among terrestrial vertebrates. The presence of healed bite marks on ceratopsian and hadrosaur fossils indicates both successful predation and intraspecific combat, suggesting that tyrannosaurs not only hunted but also engaged in territorial disputes. Their life history strategies, with rapid adolescent growth leading to different ecological roles across age classes, created predators capable of exerting pressure on multiple tiers of prey simultaneously. In southern continents, the abelisaurids assumed the mantle of apex hunters. Carnotaurus, Majungasaurus, and their relatives reveal skull morphologies adapted for rapid strikes and flesh shearing rather than prolonged bone crushing. Studies of their cervical vertebrae, showing enlarged muscle attachments, point toward powerful neck-driven attacks. Isotopic analysis of Majungasaurus teeth indicates a dietary spectrum dominated by sauropods, aligning with their coexistence with titanosaur herds in Madagascar. Their reduced forelimbs, once considered vestigial oddities, may represent convergent specialization with tyrannosaurs, where forelimb reduction facilitated balance and cranial power in predation. Alongside these giants were predators defined not by size but by intelligence and agility. Dromaeosaurids and trudontids occupied roles akin to pack-hunting canids of later epochs, though with distinct reptilian innovations. Velociraptor, Dromaeosaurus, and their kin possessed sickle claws capable of delivering slashing kicks, while their binocular vision and enlarged olfactory bulbs supported precision hunting. Evidence of cooperative strategies is inferred from trackways where groups of similar-sized dromaeosaurs moved together, though whether this indicates coordinated hunting or opportunistic congregation remains debated. If continued across evolutionary time, neurological expansion combined with social hunting could have driven these theropods toward increasingly complex cooperative behaviors. Predation extended into aquatic and aerial domains. Mosasaurs, dominant marine predators, displayed double-hinged jaws and recurved teeth adapted to seize slippery prey. Their rapid diversification in the late Cretaceous, documented in deposits from the Niobrara chalk of Kansas to the phosphate beds of Morocco, suggests high ecological flexibility. In a non-extinction scenario, continued adaptation to shifting seas might have produced forms rivaling modern orcas in complexity of hunting strategies. In the skies, Asdarchid pterosaurs, with wingspans exceeding 10 meters, likely employed stalking predation on land as well as aerial foraging. Their persistence into the latest Cretaceous hints at an ability to maintain dominance despite avian diversification, leaving open the trajectory of aerial predation had they remained uncontested. The interaction between predators and prey drove morphological escalation. Hadrosaurs evolved massive herds and acoustic communication systems, while ceratopsians developed formidable horns. Each innovation in defense forced predators to respond. Tyrannosaurs with binocular vision gained precision in targeting vulnerable areas. Abelisaurs developed rapid lateral head movements capable of inflicting tearing wounds on heavily armored prey. The result was a feedback loop in which neither side could stagnate without risking elimination from the ecological matrix. Smaller mammals and reptiles were also subjected to this predatory order. Mammalian remains from the Cretaceous frequently display tooth marks consistent with theropod predation. Burrows provided partial refuge, but any venture into open terrain carried risk. Even within mammalian niches, predation limited population densities, reinforcing their subordinate ecological roles. The constant surveillance of predators ensured that nocturnal or subterranean lifestyles remained obligatory rather than optional for small vertebrates. The evolutionary potential of predators extended beyond physical weaponry. Studies of semicircular canal structures in tyrannosaur skulls, conducted by Lawrence Whitmer and colleagues, demonstrate advanced vestibular systems that permitted rapid head movements and precise gaze stabilization. Such traits imply a predatory reliance on visual tracking during high-speed pursuits. Extrapolated across uninterrupted evolutionary time, these neurological refinements might have paralleled developments later seen in raptors among birds of prey, pushing predatory dinosaurs into even more sophisticated sensory integration. The social dynamics of predation remain one of the most unresolved aspects of dinosaur ecology. Fossil evidence of multiple tyrannosaurs found together at sites such as the Dry Island Bone Bed in Alberta raises the possibility of group behavior, though interpretations vary between cooperative hunting and competitive scavenging. If cooperative strategies were indeed emerging, then evolutionary pathways might have led to structured packs capable of bringing down prey far larger than any single predator could subdue. The implications for ecological balance are profound, as coordinated predators exert disproportionate influence on prey populations, shaping migration patterns and herd behaviors. Predators, as much as herbivores, were ecosystem engineers. Their selective pressures filtered weak or diseased individuals from populations, indirectly influencing genetic resilience. They determined the migratory rhythms of herds, dictated the spatial use of habitats, and carved out ecological niches for scavengers and smaller carnivores. Without their regulatory influence, herbivore populations might have expanded unchecked, destabilizing vegetation cycles. The continuity of predation ensured equilibrium, but equilibrium born of perpetual violence and adaptation. What remains uncertain is how far predator innovation could have advanced under uninterrupted conditions. Would encephalization in trudontids have crossed thresholds associated with tool use or problem-solving intelligence? Could apex predators like tyrannosaurs have further specialized into divergent forms, some emphasizing speed, others raw power, others stealth? The fossil record preserves only beginnings, not outcomes, leaving open trajectories of predatory evolution that remain untested in Earth's history. Among the most striking outcomes of dinosaur evolution was the persistence of one lineage into the present: the birds. Avian forms had already diverged significantly by the late Cretaceous, their fossil record testifying to experimentation with flight mechanics, body size, and ecological strategies. In a world where non-avian dinosaurs continued to dominate, these avian relatives would not have occupied vacant niches, but rather would have developed alongside their larger cousins, subject to competitive pressures that might have reshaped their evolutionary possibilities in profound ways. The transition from non-avian theropods to true birds is documented in exquisite detail within the fossil beds of Liaoning, China. Archaeopteryx, long considered the earliest bird, revealed the mosaic of traits: feathered wings, wishbone, and elongated tail, that signaled the threshold between gliding theropods and powered flyers. More derived forms such as Confuciusornis and Enantiorniths exhibited shortened tails and improved flight musculature, while Hesperornithiforms, found in North America, had already adapted to aquatic environments. By the Maastrichtian stage, birds were a diverse clade occupying aerial, riparian, and shoreline niches. Their survival depended not on displacement of their larger relatives, but on parallel diversification. Flight afforded distinct advantages. Lightweight skeletons with pneumatic bones reduced energy costs, while the keeled sternum provided anchor points for enlarged flight muscles. Studies of feather microstructure conducted by Zhonghe Zhou and colleagues revealed asymmetrical veins consistent with efficient aerodynamic function, a refinement beyond earlier protofeathers. These innovations enabled birds to exploit food sources unavailable to terrestrial dinosaurs: flying insects, fish in shallow waters, and small vertebrates in inaccessible habitats. In ecosystems otherwise saturated with giant predators and herbivores, flight offered refuge in three-dimensional space. The ecological role of birds was not limited to predation. Seed dispersal represents one of their earliest significant contributions to plant evolution. Fossilized seeds recovered from the abdominal cavities of Cretaceous bird specimens, including enantiornithines, demonstrate ingestion and excretion that would have facilitated plant colonization across wide territories. This mutualism between plants and avian dinosaurs may have accelerated the spread of angiosperms, already under pressure from herbivorous giants. If extended across additional millions of years, such dynamics could have restructured terrestrial flora in directions distinct from those shaped later by mammals. Acoustic communication also reached new dimensions among early birds. Syrinx fossils have not been preserved from the Cretaceous, but comparative anatomy suggests that their vocal capabilities may already have surpassed those of most non-avian dinosaurs. Modern birds display a range of complex songs used in territory defense and mating. Such capacities, if present in even primitive form, would have introduced acoustic competition into ecosystems dominated by low-frequency hadrosaur calls and ceratopsian displays. Vocal diversification could have served as both a reproductive isolating mechanism and a driver of social complexity, setting birds on an evolutionary course toward heightened cognition. The survival of avian dinosaurs during times of ecological stress underscores their adaptability. Isotopic analysis of Cretaceous avian fossils indicates flexible diets, ranging from insectivory to piscivory and seed consumption. The discovery of Ichthyornis with robust teeth suggests transitional feeding strategies bridging reptilian and modern avian modes of consumption. Their capacity to exploit such varied resources would have allowed them to coexist with large predators, avoiding direct competition by occupying niches too dispersed or minor to sustain massive theropods. If these pressures had continued without mass extinction, birds might have remained relatively small-bodied but increasingly specialized, spreading into every ecological margin not already dominated by non-avian dinosaurs. Evolutionary pressures would also have acted upon their brain and sensory systems. Endocasts of Cretaceous bird skulls reveal expanded optic lobes and cerebellar regions associated with flight control. Comparative studies by Aurora Konovil and Daniel Ksepka demonstrate that even basal birds displayed encephalization trends exceeding those of most reptiles. This trajectory, compounded by the demands of aerial navigation, predator evasion, and social communication, might have accelerated cognitive sophistication. The possibility arises that under uninterrupted evolutionary continuity, birds could have developed advanced problem-solving capacities while still constrained by the overshadowing presence of larger dinosaurs. The interplay between avian and non-avian dinosaurs was not solely competitive. Some relationships may have approached symbiosis. Fossilized gut contents of small theropods occasionally include bird remains, but there is also evidence of co-nesting sites where birds utilized the disturbed soils created by larger dinosaurs. In modern ecosystems, small birds often follow ungulates to capture insects flushed from vegetation, A similar pattern may have existed alongside hadrosaurs or ceratopsians, with birds exploiting ecological disturbances caused by the movements of massive herds. If this association deepened over time, cooperative dynamics could have emerged, weaving avian dinosaurs more tightly into the fabric of megafaunal life. The constraints, however, would have remained significant. The continued presence of giant pterosaurs would have restricted access to certain aerial niches, especially those requiring soaring flight over vast distances. Likewise, predation pressure from dromaeosaurs and small tyrannosaurids would have prevented many birds from achieving larger body sizes. The avian experiment, while rich in specialization, would have unfolded under constant constraint, channeling adaptations into intricacy rather than dominance. What remains unresolved is the direction such intricacy might have taken. Could advanced vocal learning have accelerated into forms of proto-language, as it did in certain modern songbirds? Would mutualism with plants have expanded to the point of shaping entire floral lineages? Could encephalization have pressed them toward manipulative intelligence comparable to corvids or parrots, but within ecosystems still ruled by terrestrial dinosaurs? These open questions underscore how evolutionary experiments do not require dominance to achieve significance. Even within constraints, birds were poised for trajectories that could have altered the balance of life in ways yet to be measured. The continuity of dinosaur life across tens of millions of years would have unfolded against the shifting framework of Earth's climate and geography. Continental drift, volcanism, and orbital variations were already reshaping environments in the late Cretaceous, and these forces would have continued to drive evolutionary pressures had ecosystems not been disrupted. Without the sudden cooling and darkness triggered by extraterrestrial impact, the climate system would have followed a more gradual trajectory, its warmth sustained by greenhouse gases and tectonic activity. During the Maastrichtian stage, global average temperatures were elevated, with no evidence of permanent ice caps. Proxy data from oxygen isotopes in marine foraminifera indicate sea surface temperatures in the tropics around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius, while polar regions supported temperate forests with conifers, ginkgos, and deciduous angiosperms. The Western Interior Seaway, a vast inland sea bisecting North America, maintained subtropical marine ecosystems in what is today the central United States. If uninterrupted, this seaway would have receded slowly as tectonic uplift raised the continent, replacing shallow marine habitats with floodplains and forests that dinosaurs would have colonized in succession. In the southern hemisphere, South America was moving steadily westward as the South Atlantic widened. Patagonia, already home to giant titanosaurs and abelosaurids, would have continued to drift toward isolation, creating evolutionary laboratories similar to those later occupied by marsupials in Australia. Africa, still connected in places to South America during the earlier Cretaceous, was separating definitively, a process that would have allowed divergent faunal assemblages to develop independently. India, moving north across the Tethys Ocean, was on course to collide with Asia within 10 to 15 million years, raising the Himalayas. That collision, in a dinosaur-dominated biosphere, would have introduced upland environments previously absent from their evolutionary experience. Volcanism was another persistent force. The Deccan Traps in present-day India, which erupted near the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, released vast amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. In a scenario without the asteroid strike, these eruptions might still have contributed to climatic fluctuations, though on scales insufficient to collapse ecosystems outright. Geochemical models suggest pulses of warming followed by short-lived cooling from sulfate aerosols. Dinosaurs, already adapted to warm climates, may have weathered these oscillations by shifting ranges, while birds and smaller theropods could have exploited their mobility to track resources. Long-term, the elevated CO2 could have maintained a greenhouse climate into the Paleogene, sustaining lush plant growth to feed large herbivores. Polar environments held particular significance. Fossil evidence from the Prince Creek Formation in Alaska documents hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, and small theropods living at latitudes that experienced months of darkness. Growth rings in their bones, studied by Holly Woodward and colleagues, indicate seasonal slowdowns in metabolism, suggesting physiological adaptations to extreme photoperiods. Some paleontologists argue for partial endothermy in these dinosaurs, enabling survival in cold seasons. If their descendants had continued to inhabit high latitudes, evolutionary pressures might have driven further refinements in thermoregulation, perhaps converging on traits akin to the thick plumage and fat layers of modern polar birds and mammals. The opening of the Arctic Ocean, which accelerated as continents drifted, would have expanded these polar habitats, providing a vast arena for such adaptations to evolve. Ocean circulation was also in flux. The closing of the Tethys Seaway and the deepening of the Atlantic altered global thermohaline patterns, redistributing heat and nutrients. Marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs were deeply tied to these conditions, but in a continuing Mesozoic world, their descendants might have adapted to new currents and prey distributions. Dinosaurs, while terrestrial, would have been indirectly affected by shifts in precipitation patterns, vegetation zones, and productivity of coastal ecosystems where many species congregated. A prolonged greenhouse world, lacking major ice sheets, would have elevated sea levels by hundreds of meters compared to the present, inundating low-lying regions and reshaping habitats repeatedly across evolutionary time. Geographic isolation fostered evolutionary experimentation. Madagascar, separated from Africa since the mid-Cretaceous, already supported unique abelisaurid lineages and dwarf sauropods. Continued isolation would have deepened endemism, possibly producing forms adapted to insular constraints, reduced body sizes, novel feeding strategies, or specialized locomotion. Similar dynamics on smaller landmasses such as Europe, then an archipelago of islands, might have generated dwarf ceratopsians, compact hadrosaurs, and flight-adapted theropods adapted to fragmented habitats. Such insular radiations could have paralleled the later evolution of pygmy elephants and dwarf hippos, but within a dinosaurian context. The interplay of geography and climate also carried consequences for atmospheric composition. As mountain ranges rose, silicate weathering processes would have drawn down carbon dioxide, creating gradual cooling trends. Yet volcanism and methane release from herbivores counteracted these sinks. The balance between these processes would have determined whether Earth sustained its greenhouse equilibrium or drifted toward cooler regimes. Dinosaurs, locked into these dynamics, would have responded with shifts in range, body size, and physiology. Adaptations to cooling, should it have progressed significantly, could have included denser feather coverage, metabolic flexibility, and behavioral changes such as seasonal migration across continents. The magnitude of uninterrupted evolutionary time within these shifting climates cannot be overstated. Continental collisions, sea level oscillations, and volcanic outpourings would have generated a moving target for adaptation. Dinosaurs, already demonstrating resilience to a wide spectrum of habitats, from deserts in Mongolia to rainforests in South America, possessed the evolutionary toolkit to exploit these changes. Their presence as ecological keystones meant that every alteration in geography or climate would have been refracted through their bodies, their migrations, and their feeding patterns. Yet it is precisely the unpredictability of these environmental forces that leaves the trajectory unresolved. Would the slow assembly of supermountain ranges have fragmented dinosaur lineages into isolated refugia, spurring bursts of adaptive radiation? Would persistent greenhouse climates have prolonged gigantism indefinitely, or would cooling trends have pressured dinosaurs towards smaller, more insulated forms? The balance of tectonic forces and atmospheric chemistry ensured that evolutionary experiments were never static, keeping the future suspended between continuity and transformation. The question of intelligence among dinosaurs remains one of the most provocative in evolutionary science. While many lineages were adapted primarily for size, speed, or defense, certain theropods displayed neurological characteristics that set them apart from the majority of reptilian life. These traits, still embryonic in the Cretaceous, invite speculation about how cognition might have advanced if uninterrupted by extinction. Relative brain size provides a measurable starting point. Encephalization quotient, EQ, which compares brain mass to predicted values based on body size, is often used as a proxy for cognitive capacity. Most large-body dinosaurs, such as sauropods and ceratopsians, registered very low EQs, consistent with animals whose behavior depended on instinct and limited social coordination. In contrast, trudontids achieved EQ values approaching those of modern birds and surpassing those of many non-avian reptiles. Endocasts from Trudon formosa skulls, examined by Dale Russell and later by Emily Rayfield, reveal expanded cerebral hemispheres, large optic lobes, and a relatively enlarged cerebellum. These features point to enhanced sensory integration and motor control, prerequisites for sophisticated behavioral repertoires. Sensory specialization supported this neurological profile. Trudontid orbital morphology indicates large eyes oriented forward, providing stereoscopic vision with depth perception crucial for predatory precision. Their cochlear lengths, reconstructed from inner ear fossils, suggest sensitivity to a wide range of frequencies, possibly enabling complex vocal communication. Combined with acute olfactory bulbs, this array of sensory systems would have equipped them with the capacity to perceive, interpret, and respond to their environments in ways surpassing the reflexive behaviors typical of reptiles. Tool use, social cooperation, and symbolic communication are often cited as hallmarks of advanced cognition, but these traits require both neurological potential and ecological necessity. Dromaeosaurids, with their grasping forelimbs and semi-opposable digits, possessed the anatomical means for rudimentary manipulation. While no direct evidence of tool use exists, their morphology invites comparison with corvids and primates, where manual dexterity enabled the exploitation of resources inaccessible to less versatile animals. The selective pressures driving such behaviors could have included competition with larger predators, seasonal scarcity, or the exploitation of novel ecological niches. Sociality provides another avenue for the escalation of intelligence. Trackways attributed to dromaeosaurs and evidence of group nesting behaviors suggest that at least some theropods engaged in collective activities. Cooperative hunting, if confirmed, would have required coordination, communication, and role differentiation within groups. Cognitive demands increase significantly when individuals must track the behavior of others, anticipate actions, and adjust strategies dynamically. Over evolutionary timescales, such pressures can reinforce neurological complexity, as observed in the correlation between group size and brain size in mammals and birds. The hypothetical trajectory toward intelligence among dinosaurs has often been represented by the so-called dinosauroid model proposed by Dale Russell in 1982. Russell speculated that if trudontids had continued to evolve, encephalization could have produced a bipedal, humanoid-like form. While criticized for anthropocentric bias, the model underscores the plausibility of sustained neurological expansion in certain lineages. Evolution rarely follows predictable paths, but the underlying observation, that intelligence emerges when neural resources, anatomy, and ecological context align, remains valid. Energy budgets constrain these possibilities. Large brains demand high caloric intake, particularly of protein and fat. Dinosaurs capable of encephalization would have required reliable access to nutrient-rich diets. Small theropods feeding on vertebrate prey, eggs, and invertebrates may have satisfied these demands more easily than herbivores, whose cellulose-based diets offered limited surplus energy. If evolutionary arms races had continued, one might expect selective pressures favoring dietary flexibility, opportunistic feeding, and scavenging behaviors that could sustain increasing neurological costs. Thermoregulation intersects with this discussion. Evidence from isotopic analyses of dinosaur bone suggests varying degrees of mesothermy, an intermediate metabolic state between reptilian ectothermy and mammalian endothermy. Mesothermy could provide a balance, enough metabolic heat to sustain activity without the exorbitant caloric demands of full endothermy. Such physiology may have offered a platform for encephalization, enabling higher brain function without overwhelming energy requirements. If mesothermy shifted gradually toward full endothermy in select lineages, the capacity for prolonged activity and brain development would have increased correspondingly. Reproductive strategies also played a role. Dinosaurs such as oviraptorids demonstrated brooding behavior, suggesting a degree of parental investment that surpasses the simple egg-laying strategies of most reptiles. Extended care increases survival of offspring, but it also creates social environments where learning and communication can flourish. Cognitive skills often develop in contexts where juveniles interact extensively with adults, acquiring behaviors not purely determined by instinct. Over evolutionary time, the reinforcement of such parental systems could have served as scaffolding for increasingly complex learning. Environmental volatility would have acted as a crucible. Climatic shifts, geographic barriers, and fluctuations in prey availability test species not only physically but cognitively. Flexible problem-solving, memory of resource locations, and adaptive group strategies are favored in unpredictable conditions. Dinosaurs with greater neurological resources would have been disproportionately equipped to navigate these pressures, tilting selection in their favor. If such dynamics persisted across millions of years, the gradual ratcheting effect could have driven lineages toward unprecedented levels of intelligence. Yet intelligence alone does not dictate evolutionary success. The surrounding matrix of competition with larger predators, vulnerability to environmental stress, and the constraints of body design could have limited the extent to which cognition translated into dominance. Dromaeosaurs and troodontids, despite their neurological promise, remained relatively small, and their survival would always have been contingent on avoiding displacement by larger carnivores. The tension between potential and constraint defines their evolutionary horizon. What remains unresolved is the threshold at which neurological development would have transformed from adaptive enhancement into a force capable of reshaping ecosystems. Could selective pressures have favored the emergence of problem-solving societies, capable of manipulating environments as humans eventually did? Or would intelligence have remained a subordinate trait, useful for hunting and reproduction but insufficient to alter the broader balance of life? The fossil record cannot provide this answer, leaving open a trajectory whose possibilities extend beyond the data available, suspended between probability and speculation. The absence of a global extinction pulse at the close of the Cretaceous would have constrained mammalian diversification and, with it, the evolutionary trajectory that produced primates. Without ecological release, placentals, marsupials, and monotremes might have remained in niches defined by insectivory, scavenging, or nocturnality, never breaching the limits imposed by reptilian megafauna. In such a world, the anthropoid lineage may not have arisen at all. Yet the possibility remains that mammals, through persistence and incremental adaptation, could have carved pathways to greater complexity, setting the stage for potential coexistence with dinosaurs rather than displacement. The fossil record demonstrates that mammals were already experimenting with diverse morphologies before the impact event. Studies of Cretaceous metatherians and eutherians from the North American and Asian fossil beds reveal early attempts at arboreal locomotion, gliding, and burrowing. While constrained in scale, these experiments illustrate an underlying evolutionary plasticity. If allowed more time, mammalian lineages might have exploited niches beyond the immediate reach of dinosaurs, high canopy environments, subterranean habitats, or extreme latitudes. In these spaces, selection could have favored traits conducive to brain enlargement, dexterity, and complex sociality. Yet ecological competition would have remained unforgiving. Apex predators such as tyrannosaurids, abelisaurids, and dromaeosaurs left little space for medium-sized mammalian carnivores to emerge. Large-bodied herbivores monopolized primary plant resources, eliminating the possibility of grazing mammals establishing dominance. Mammals would have been forced into peripheral strategies, relying on agility, intelligence, or adaptability rather than size and strength. In such circumstances, encephalization might have proceeded not as an inevitability but as a precarious gamble, an investment in cognition to compensate for physical inferiority. Had primates nonetheless evolved, their pathway would have differed markedly from the one traced in our actual history. Arboreal adaptations, such as grasping hands, stereoscopic vision, and flexible shoulder joints, may have remained advantageous in dense forests where smaller body sizes avoided confrontation with dinosaurs. Yet the expansion into open savannas, which fueled hominin evolution millions of years later, would have been hindered by the continued presence of large herbivores and their attendant predators. The ecological vacuum that supported bipedalism, tool use, and social hunting among early humans would have remained filled by creatures already entrenched in those roles. Coexistence scenarios invite difficult questions about the dynamics between intelligent mammals and dinosaurian overlords. Small groups of primates, even if they achieved stone tool technology, would have lived under constant threat of predation. Migration patterns would have been shaped not by climatic variation alone, but by the seasonal movements of ceratopsian herds and the stalking ranges of tyrannosaurs. Agricultural beginnings, should they have arisen, would have faced devastation from sauropods or hadrosaurs consuming entire crop fields in a single feeding event. The challenge of sustaining permanent settlements under such pressures would have demanded defensive technologies well in advance of those developed in human prehistory. Conversely, one cannot dismiss the possibility that selective pressures created by dinosaur dominance might have accelerated human innovation. Persistent exposure to catastrophic predation could have driven the rapid development of weapons, cooperative defense strategies, and fortified dwellings. The cultural trajectory of humanity in such a world, if it had arisen, would have been forged in a constant battle with megafauna. Spears, arrows, and fire may have emerged not merely as tools of subsistence, but as existential necessities for survival. The presence of dinosaurs would also have transformed the symbolic and cultural dimensions of human life. Religious systems, mythologies, and art often emerge from interactions with powerful natural forces. In a coexistence framework, the imagery of colossal predators and armored herbivores would have dominated cultural consciousness. Entire cosmologies might have been built around these creatures, integrating them into systems of reverence, fear, or attempted domestication. The human imagination, shaped by predators that dwarfed lions or bears, would have reflected a reality of perpetual contest with giants. Disease ecology presents another dimension of this hypothetical coexistence. Dinosaurs carried their own microbial communities, parasites, and pathogens. Prolonged interaction with these organisms could have influenced mammalian immune systems, driving coevolutionary arms races similar to those observed in human history with domesticated animals. The health landscape of a dinosaur-human world would have been marked not only by competition for space and food, but by the invisible pressures of microbial exchange. The scale of risk in such a scenario cannot be overstated. Agricultural surpluses that sustained permanent villages and cities might have been rendered unsustainable by megaherbivore raids. Predator avoidance could have restricted human activity to nocturnal hours, compressing social and economic life into limited windows of safety. The trajectory of technology, art, and science might have accelerated in some domains but stagnated in others, constrained by the constant need for defense and mobility. Whether humanity could have emerged at all, or survived long enough to construct civilizations, rests on fragile contingencies. The balance between ecological opportunity and predatory suppression would have been knife-edged, with every adaptation contested by forces far greater than ourselves. The unresolved question is whether intelligence, once it appeared, could ever have outpaced the relentless pressures of a world still ruled by dinosaurs, or whether it would have remained an isolated experiment extinguished before achieving permanence. The development of agriculture is inseparable from ecological stability. In human history, The domestication of plants and animals was made possible by the absence of megafaunal competitors large enough to devastate fields and settlements. In a world where dinosaurs remained, the very foundations of cultivation would have confronted obstacles of a scale rarely encountered in terrestrial ecosystems. The first problem lies in the vulnerability of crops to megaherbivores. A herd of hadrosaurs or ceratopsians, moving across a floodplain, could strip hectares of vegetation within hours. Sauropods, with their towering necks and insatiable appetites, would have flattened entire orchards and consumed not only leaves but young trees and shrubs that humans might have cultivated. Unlike insects or rodents, whose impacts can be managed with barriers or poisons, the destructive power of such giants would have overwhelmed the capacities of early agriculturalists. Archaeological analogies drawn from human conflict with elephants in Africa and Asia offer a glimpse of this dynamic. Fields trampled overnight, granaries raided, and lives lost in attempts at defense. Yet elephants are diminutive compared to titanosaurs, making the challenge proportionally greater. The second challenge involves domestication. Human societies historically relied on herbivores of manageable size and temperament. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, whose breeding could be controlled and whose feeding requirements were compatible with human-scale economies. Dinosaurs presented different physiological and behavioral profiles. Herding species such as hadrosaurs might have displayed social tendencies favorable to domestication, but their body size and unpredictable feeding habits would have made confinement impossible without advanced infrastructure. Ceratopsians, armed with horns and frills, posed constant risk to handlers, while ankylosaurs, though plant-eaters, carried heavy armor and clubbed tails capable of destroying enclosures. Sauropods were so large that no form of early pen or corral could contain them, and their dietary intake would have exceeded any agricultural surplus available. Smaller dinosaurs might have provided more viable candidates. Ornithopods of modest size, some under 2 meters long, could have resembled goats or deer in their ecological role. Their reproductive rates and group behavior might have been amenable to selective breeding if captured young. Theropods, however, introduced additional hazards. While some species were no larger than turkeys or dogs, their predatory instincts would have made them dangerous. Nevertheless, the potential for taming smaller carnivores, analogous to the domestication of cats as rodent controllers, cannot be dismissed. Human settlements under constant pressure from vermin might have tolerated smaller theropods in exchange for their pest removal services, though this arrangement would have carried risks. The cultivation of plants would also have been altered by dinosaurian influence. Angiosperms in the late Cretaceous had already diversified under pressure from herbivores, developing rapid growth cycles and chemical defenses. In a continued dinosaurian world, plants suitable for agriculture may have possessed even stronger deterrents. Thick cuticles, bitter compounds, or rapid flowering strategies that would complicate domestication. Human agricultural practices might have revolved around species resilient enough to withstand megafaunal browsing or capable of regrowth after trampling. Root crops, tubers, and underground storage organs might have been favored, as their edible portions remained hidden from large herbivores. Tree crops could also have been critical, though maintaining orchards against sauropods would have required constant defense. Settlement patterns would necessarily reflect these pressures. Permanent villages would have required fortifications not against rival human groups alone, but against incursions of multi-ton herbivores. Defensive architecture, ditches, palisades, stone walls, would have emerged earlier and on a larger scale. Fossilized evidence of herd trampling in Cretaceous floodplains illustrates the futility of simple barriers. Even substantial earthworks could be breached. Human ingenuity may have been forced toward the creation of spiked moats, burning deterrents, or organized watch systems to repel nightly raids. The agricultural surplus required to sustain early states might never have accumulated without such defenses. Technological acceleration is a conceivable outcome of these conditions. Constant conflict with megafauna could have driven the invention of weapons and tools centuries or millennia earlier than in our actual history. The use of fire to create exclusion zones, the construction of large-scale traps, and the harnessing of collective hunting strategies might have been directed not at game animals but at protecting crops and settlements. In this sense, agriculture in a dinosaur world would have been indistinguishable from perpetual warfare against encroaching beasts. Domestication might also have included indirect relationships. Scavenging species, whether avian or small theropod, could have benefited from human waste, forming commensal associations akin to those between humans and dogs or vultures. Such interactions, repeated across generations, could have fostered semi-domesticated roles where dinosaurs lived on the periphery of human communities. Yet the unpredictability of reptilian temperament raises questions about the sustainability of such bonds. Unlike wolves, which evolved pack sociality conducive to cooperation, most theropods were solitary or engaged in hierarchical structures, complicating integration into human societies. Beyond subsistence, the cultural consequences of agriculture under dinosaur pressure would have been profound. Agricultural rituals, myths, and protective deities may have been shaped not only by the cycles of planting and harvest, but by the looming threat of destruction from herds. Seasonal migrations of sauropods could have coincided with harvest times, turning festivals into acts of appeasement or defiance against overwhelming natural forces. The agricultural calendar itself might have been synchronized not with solar or lunar cycles alone, but with the predictable rhythms of dinosaur movement across landscapes. The possibility of symbiosis lingers, however. Certain plants may have benefited from dinosaur activity: seed dispersal through ingestion, fertilization through dung, and ground disturbance through trampling. Humans could have exploited these processes deliberately, planting crops in zones where dinosaurs regularly passed, relying on them to till soil or spread nutrients. Such strategies would have required deep ecological knowledge and precise timing, balancing risk with reward. The boundary between agriculture and ecological opportunism might have blurred in ways unfamiliar to modern history. What remains uncertain is whether agriculture could ever have stabilized under such conditions. Would human societies have devised sufficient defenses to protect fields against megafaunal destruction, or would agriculture have been perpetually undermined by incursions? Could domestication of smaller dinosaur species have offered substitutes for cattle and sheep, or would the unpredictability of reptilian behavior have thwarted sustained breeding programs? The unresolved tension lies in whether human ingenuity could have outpaced the ecological dominance of dinosaurs, or whether cultivation itself would have remained a fragile experiment vulnerable to collapse at every turn. The emergence of complex civilization requires a measure of ecological predictability, reliable food surpluses, and the ability to secure settlements against disruptive forces. In a world where dinosaurs remained the dominant terrestrial vertebrates, these preconditions would have been challenged at every stage. The pressures that large predators and herbivores imposed on early agriculture would not have ended with subsistence. They would have extended into the architecture of cities, the organization of states, and the evolution of technology itself. Urbanization depends on the concentration of population, but concentrated populations generate concentrated resources, and concentrated resources attract opportunistic feeders. For dinosaurs, especially large herbivores, cultivated fields and stored grain would have been irresistible. A single breach of city defenses by a herd of hadrosaurs or the trampling advance of sauropods could have undone years of labor. Unlike human adversaries, who could be deterred by treaties, politics, or fear of reprisal, animals responded only to immediate environmental cues. The defense of early urban centers would therefore have required physical infrastructure on a scale far beyond that historically needed. Archaeological parallels from regions where humans coexisted with elephants and bison illustrate the magnitude of these challenges. Stone walls, deep moats, and reinforced gates became standard defensive structures not just against rival polities, but against animals capable of overwhelming farmland. Yet elephants, weighing 6 tons, are trivial compared to titanosaurs exceeding 40 tons. Walls that held against elephants would have collapsed under the weight of sauropods. This reality implies that urban planning would have been inseparable from the constant expectation of incursions, with fortifications becoming the primary expenditure of early states. Predators introduced additional hazards. Apex theropods, equipped with acute sensory systems and capable of rapid pursuit, would have treated human settlements as potential sources of food. Archaeological analogies with lions and leopards demonstrate how large carnivores adapt to human proximity, often preying on livestock or stragglers at settlement edges. Theropods of tyrannosaur or abelisaurid scale would have multiplied these dangers. Patrols, watchtowers, and collective defense measures would have been mandatory components of daily life. Nighttime movement beyond walls might have been nearly impossible without coordinated groups armed with deterrents. The constant threat of destruction could have reshaped political authority. Leadership may have been justified not only through control of human rivals, but through success in defending against dinosaurs. Military and religious authority could have merged in rulers who claimed mastery over natural forces, erecting temples as much to repel animals as to honor gods. Ritual sacrifices or public displays of slain predators might have been central to civic life, reinforcing the image of the state as protector. The mythology of such civilizations would almost inevitably have placed dinosaurs at the center of cosmological order, symbols of chaos restrained by human ingenuity. Economic systems would have adapted accordingly. Surpluses might have been devoted disproportionately to defense infrastructure rather than trade or luxury. The construction of barriers, traps, and stockpiles of deterrent substances, such as pitch or firewood, could have consumed resources otherwise allocated to commerce. Metallurgy, weapon-making, and siege technologies may have advanced earlier, driven by the need to repel not human armies but biological adversaries. The evolution of ballista-like engines or incendiary projectiles might have been accelerated by the necessity of driving off herds or predators that threatened city walls. The psychological landscape of civilization would also have been transformed. Collective trauma from periodic attacks could have imprinted cultural memory with narratives of survival and vigilance. Festivals might have celebrated not harvests alone, but the successful repulsion of dinosaur raids. Architecture may have reflected defensive priorities. Cities with elevated terraces, stepped pyramids serving as refuges during assaults, and subterranean storage vaults inaccessible to trampling feet. In such societies, art and literature would have reflected awe and fear toward creatures whose scale dwarfed human measures of strength. Transportation and communication would have faced constant obstacles. Roads cutting through dinosaur migration routes could have been destroyed seasonally, requiring constant repair. Caravans transporting goods would have needed escorts not just against bandits, but against opportunistic predators stalking from forests or riverbanks. Trade might have been restricted to fortified corridors, heavily guarded and maintained at great expense. The geography of civilization could have clustered in regions less frequented by dinosaurs, mountain valleys, islands, or arid zones unattractive to large herbivores. This geographical filtering would have determined the very locations where states arose, creating a map of human history radically unlike the one we know. The unresolved factor is whether coexistence could have driven human societies into perpetual militarization, or whether strategies of deterrence and accommodation might have emerged. Fire, noise, and coordinated group displays can deter modern large animals. Similar methods, magnified and ritualized, might have been employed against dinosaurs. Entire professions could have specialized in driving herds away from settlements, blending animal behavior knowledge with engineering. Over time, such expertise might have evolved into proto-sciences of zoology and ethology, centuries earlier than they did historically, but developed under existential pressure rather than curiosity. Yet none of these adaptations guarantee security. The unpredictability of migratory herds, the opportunism of predators, and the sheer scale of ecological forces at play meant that no city could remain permanently safe. Every structure carried the risk of collapse, every harvest the threat of loss. The question that lingers is whether civilization, once it arose, could have achieved stability in such an environment, or whether it would have been forced into cycles of growth and destruction, each generation building anew under the shadow of creatures it could never fully control. The trajectory of modern science, shaped in part by the absence of dinosaurs, would have unfolded differently if these animals had remained integrated into ecosystems and human societies. Knowledge systems that developed through paleontology, comparative anatomy, and evolutionary biology would have taken alternate paths, directed not toward reconstructing extinct creatures, but toward studying living giants whose physiology, behavior, and interactions demanded explanation. The field of natural history, which blossomed during the Enlightenment, would have been dominated by efforts to classify and understand dinosaurs. Taxonomic systems, such as those pioneered by Carl Linnaeus, would have required expansion to accommodate thousands of large-bodied species, many of which spanned multiple continents and displayed enormous variation in form. The debates that occupied early naturalists about the boundaries between reptiles, birds, and mammals would have been further complicated by the constant presence of intermediate forms. Museums and collections, rather than being filled with fossils and reconstructions, might have displayed skins, bones, and preserved specimens of recently captured or killed dinosaurs. Physiology would have been a central scientific pursuit. The question of thermoregulation, whether dinosaurs were ectothermic, endothermic, or mesothermic, would not have been a matter of inference from isotopes or bone histology, but an observable feature measurable through direct experimentation. 17th and 18th century anatomists, who dissected whales, elephants, and horses, would have turned their knives toward hadrosaurs or small theropods, documenting organ systems in unprecedented detail. The respiratory adaptations of sauropods, with their pneumatic air sacs, could have been discovered centuries before modern medicine recognized analogous mechanisms in birds. Insights into oxygen exchange, metabolic rates, and cardiovascular efficiency may have advanced respiratory physiology at a pace far exceeding historical timelines. Genetics, too, would have been profoundly altered. The sequencing of dinosaur genomes, once molecular biology matured, would have provided a comparative framework reshaping our understanding of vertebrate evolution. Instead of relying on birds as the sole surviving dinosaurian lineage, scientists would have compared a broad spectrum of species ranging from massive sauropods to agile dromaeosaurs. The reconstruction of evolutionary trees would have been anchored not in fossils alone but in living DNA, exposing the branching complexity of archosaur evolution with unparalleled clarity. Medical science, drawing from these genetic insights, might have identified unique proteins, enzymes, and metabolic pathways with therapeutic potential. Resistance to disease in large-bodied dinosaurs, bone regeneration in ceratopsians, or immune responses in theropods could have offered templates for novel treatments. Ecology as a discipline would have grown under different pressures. The constant interaction between humans and dinosaurs would have required systematic study of migration, feeding behavior, and population dynamics. Early ecologists such as Charles Elton, who formalized concepts of food chains and trophic levels, might have directed their efforts toward quantifying the massive energy flows generated by dinosaur herds. The measurement of biomass consumption, methane production, and nutrient cycling in real time would have given ecological science a global, megafaunal orientation from its inception. The human role within ecosystems would have been defined against a backdrop of giants whose impact dwarfed human activity, reframing debates about balance, sustainability, and exploitation. Paleontology itself, as a distinct science, would likely not have emerged in its current form. The 19th century fascination with fossils that gave rise to Richard Owen's coining of the term dinosauria in 1842 would have been replaced by zoological descriptions of living creatures. Fossil evidence would still have existed, but its role in reconstructing deep time would have been overshadowed by the immediacy of studying living specimens. Geology would still have revealed the immensity of Earth's history, But evolutionary narratives might have been framed less around extinction events and more around the continuity of lineages observable across both fossil and living forms. The study of behavior would have posed challenges and opportunities of extraordinary scale. Ethology, as developed by figures like Konrad Lorenz and Nikolaus Tinbergen, would have extended to species whose social systems included herd migrations of thousands of individuals, cooperative predation by packs of theropods, and vocal communication across kilometers. The technologies of observation, binoculars, cameras, and later satellite tracking, would have been developed with the explicit purpose of monitoring animals whose influence on human life was direct and immediate. The scale of behavioral data gathered from dinosaurs would have redefined the scope of zoology. Technology itself would have been redirected under these pressures. Engineering, architecture, and material science would have evolved to address the constant need for defense and monitoring. The study of biomechanics in dinosaurs could have inspired advances in robotics and mechanical design. The articulation of joints in sauropod necks or the tensile strength of ceratopsian horns would have provided templates for structural engineering. Biomimicry, a field only recently formalized, might have developed earlier, with military engineers and architects drawing directly from dinosaur morphology to design weapons, armor, and infrastructure. The cultural perception of science would also have shifted. Dinosaurs, ever present in daily life, would not have been relegated to the realm of museums and popular imagination, but to the core of human survival. Scientific inquiry into their biology would have carried immediate consequences for agriculture, defense, and medicine. Governments and institutions might have funded large-scale dinosaur sciences, with urgency comparable to historical military projects. Universities could have housed entire faculties dedicated not to paleontology but to archosaur studies, integrating genetics, ecology, anatomy, and engineering. The open question is how such a reorientation of science would have influenced humanity's broader trajectory. Would the urgency of survival against dinosaurs have accelerated discoveries in physics, chemistry, and biology, or would resources have been diverted endlessly toward managing ecological conflict? Could breakthroughs in medicine and engineering inspired by dinosaurs have pushed human technology centuries ahead of schedule, or would the constant demands of containment and coexistence have delayed exploration beyond Earth? The balance between scientific curiosity and practical necessity, already fragile in human history, would have been strained to its limits by the presence of creatures whose scale demanded attention at every level of society. The transition from agrarian societies to industrial economies was accompanied by an unprecedented reconfiguration of energy, materials, and technology. In a world where dinosaurs had remained a dominant presence, this transition would have been neither linear nor familiar. Industrialization, while capable of generating machinery powerful enough to alter landscapes, would have unfolded under constant negotiation with ecosystems inhabited by creatures of immense size and force. Factories, railways, and cities of the 19th century were constructed to accommodate human needs and domesticated animals. Horses, oxen, and camels served as draft power until mechanical engines replaced them. The persistence of dinosaurs would have altered this balance from the outset. The question of whether large herbivorous dinosaurs could have been harnessed for labor emerges as both practical and problematic. Titanosaurs or hadrosaurs, if controlled, might have been capable of hauling heavy loads, plowing vast tracts of land, or transporting raw materials. Yet their feeding requirements and unpredictable behavior would have made dependence on them unreliable. Unlike oxen or horses, whose metabolic rates and temperaments allowed integration into human economies, dinosaurs were physiologically unsuited to sustained labor under confinement. Their role as beasts of burden might have remained limited to speculative experiments rather than widespread practice. Industrial development would also have confronted the destructive potential of dinosaurs directly. Railways cut across landscapes that, in this alternate history, were still traversed by migrating herds of ceratopsians or hadrosaurs. Collisions between locomotives and multi-ton animals could have caused catastrophic derailments, making the expansion of rail infrastructure a dangerous enterprise. Engineers might have been forced to design elevated tracks, reinforced barriers, or even early warning systems to prevent incursions. Such adaptations would have demanded higher costs and slowed the spread of transportation networks, altering patterns of trade and settlement. Urban environments, already vulnerable in earlier stages of civilization, would have required industrial-scale defenses. The construction of steel barriers, electrified fences, and armed patrols could have become integral aspects of city planning. Electricity, introduced in the late 19th century, might have been adopted not only for lighting and communication but as a deterrent system against animal incursions. High-voltage barriers surrounding farmland and transport corridors could have emerged as some of the earliest applications of large-scale electrical grids, shifting the trajectory of infrastructure development toward containment and defense. The presence of predatory dinosaurs would have influenced industrial weapons technology. Firearms, artillery, and explosives, already products of human conflict, might have been tested and refined against apex predators. The arms race between states could have been paralleled by an arms race between humans and megafauna, with technological escalation driven as much by ecological necessity as by geopolitical rivalry. The mechanization of warfare, machine guns, tanks, and aircraft, might have found their earliest demonstrations not on battlefields against human opponents, but in efforts to secure transport routes and agricultural zones from constant animal threats. Scientific study of dinosaurs, integrated into industrial economies, would also have reshaped medicine and engineering. The study of dinosaur bone structure, with its pneumatic cavities and strength-to-weight efficiencies, could have informed architecture and bridge building during the industrial era. The mechanics of sauropod neck articulation or ceratopsian horn reinforcement might have provided analogies for cranes, towers, and armor plating. Dinosaurs, living and studied, would have been models of biomechanics that inspired technological innovation long before the 20th century formalization of biomimicry. The expansion of fossil fuel industries might also have been affected. Coal mines, oil wells, and later natural gas extraction often disrupt ecosystems. In this scenario, workers would have faced not only geological hazards but encounters with dinosaurs in remote areas. Industrial accidents could have involved not merely cave-ins or explosions, but attacks from predators drawn to human activity. Safety protocols, worker housing, and industrial organization would have incorporated defensive strategies against animal interference. The exploitation of energy resources would therefore have unfolded more cautiously, potentially delaying or redirecting the pace of industrial expansion. The transition into the 20th century and the rise of aviation would have intersected with aerial dinosaurs still present in ecosystems. Large pterosaurs, if they had survived, could have posed threats to early aircraft, just as birds sometimes cause collisions today. Air travel might have required specialized measures, noise deterrents, reinforced cockpits, or altered flight paths to avoid migration corridors. Aviation technologies could have advanced under dual pressures: competition among nations and the need to secure skies against living hazards. Space exploration, emblematic of the modern age, raises deeper questions. The industrial and technological surpluses that allowed humanity to divert resources into rockets and orbital platforms depended on stable societies free from constant existential threats. If civilizations had been perpetually engaged in containing dinosaurs, the allocation of resources to space programs might have been delayed. Yet one can imagine an alternative, where the pressures of survival against megafauna accelerated technological ingenuity. The ability to defend crops, cities, and transport against animals weighing tens of tons might have required advances in metallurgy, energy storage, and projectile physics that later translated directly into rocketry. The Saturn V may have owed its lineage not only to the Cold War, but to centuries of engineering sharpened against the problem of dinosaurs. Culturally, the industrial imagination would have been permeated by dinosaurs. literature, art, and film in our timeline often depicted them as symbols of deep time and extinction. In this alternate history, they would have been symbols of constant presence, incorporated into industrial propaganda and national identity. Posters might have depicted locomotives racing herds of hadrosaurs, or factories defended by cannons against tyrannosaurs, celebrating human mastery of technology over biological giants. The cultural ethos of industrial societies would have fused human progress with a narrative of survival amidst overwhelming natural opposition. Yet the unresolved question remains whether such societies could ever have transcended the perpetual cycle of containment. Would industrial economies, strained by the need to defend infrastructure and settlements, have accumulated the surpluses necessary to fuel global exploration, scientific specialization, and spaceflight? Or would the constant demands of survival against dinosaurs have kept humanity locked into a cycle of adaptation, ingenious yet constrained, inventive yet never fully free from the ecological weight pressing upon them? The tension between technological aspiration and biological reality would have defined the industrial age in ways that remain open to speculation, pressing forward into the uncertainty of how far human ingenuity could extend under such conditions. The persistence of dinosaurs across the epochs of Earth's history would not only have altered ecological and cultural landscapes, but also raised deeper questions about contingency in evolution. The absence of the Chicxulub impact leaves unresolved the very conditions that made human emergence possible. Was intelligence, capable of abstract reasoning, language, and technological civilization, inevitable in some lineage, or was it the fragile outcome of a sequence of improbable events? Mass extinctions act as evolutionary resets, redistributing ecological opportunity. In the real trajectory of history, mammals filled the void left by dinosaurs, radiating into forms that eventually produced primates. In a counterfactual scenario, without such a reset, evolutionary innovation might have concentrated within dinosaur lineages themselves. The neurological expansion already observable in trudontids and dromaeosaurs suggests that at least some theropods were on a path toward increasing behavioral complexity. Whether this trajectory could have culminated in tool use, symbolic communication, or cumulative culture remains an unresolved problem, shaped as much by ecological constraints as by genetic potential. The larger philosophical dilemma is whether the rise of self-aware intelligence was a necessary outcome of natural selection or a historical accident. Stephen Jay Gould argued that if one could rewind the tape of life, the replay would yield outcomes radically different from the present. Dinosaurs offer the most striking test case for this argument. Given uninterrupted evolutionary time, could they have produced a lineage with the cognitive capacities we now associate with humans, or would their evolutionary momentum have remained oriented towards size, specialization, and ecological dominance rather than abstract thought? Geological forces, too, complicate this counterfactual. Continental drift, volcanic outpourings, and orbital variations would have continued to reshape environments. Dinosaurs had already demonstrated remarkable resilience to such changes across the Mesozoic. The question is whether resilience alone would have ensured continuity, or whether new pressures might have redirected evolution in unforeseen ways. Cooling trends induced by mountain building, shifts in sea level, or fluctuations in atmospheric gases could have imposed selective regimes favoring smaller, insulated, more cognitively flexible forms. Yet the pathways such pressures would have opened remain speculative, their outcomes unknowable within the limits of the fossil record. The presence or absence of humanity introduces another layer of uncertainty. If mammals never rose to dominance, the planet might have remained a dinosaur world indefinitely, its ecosystems perpetually mediated by reptilian giants. If mammals had emerged in peripheral niches and gradually accumulated adaptations for intelligence, their trajectory would have been shaped by constant competition with dinosaurs, not by ecological release. In such a scenario, the story of civilization would be one of survival and contest, where technological progress arose less from curiosity and more from the imperative of defense. The entire framework of human history, its political structures, religious systems, and scientific endeavors, would have been refracted through the lens of coexistence with megafauna that never yielded their supremacy. The counterfactual also unsettles the meaning of extinction itself. The Chicxulub impact has often been interpreted as an act of cosmic contingency, a random strike that reshaped life's trajectory. Yet some scientists, including Walter Alvarez, have suggested that asteroid impacts of significant size occur with regular probability across geological time. If not the Chicxulub event, perhaps another would eventually have imposed a similar filter, eliminating dominant lineages and opening space for others. The mystery is whether the timing of such events, arriving millions of years earlier or later, would have allowed alternative intelligences to emerge, or whether chance had to align precisely for our own lineage to take shape. Modern science, confronted with living dinosaurs, would have been forced to grapple directly with these questions. The presence of intelligent non-human species, had they evolved, would have tested the anthropocentric framework of philosophy and biology alike. Ethics, law, and political thought would have confronted the problem of coexistence, not with domesticated animals, but with rival intelligences shaped by entirely different evolutionary histories. Whether humanity could have shared the planet as equals, or whether competition would have driven one lineage to dominate the other, is a question with no empirical answer, only speculation grounded in evolutionary principles. The unresolved condition of this scenario lies in its confrontation with inevitability. Evolution is not goal-directed, and yet intelligence arose at least once. Could it have arisen again in a world ruled by dinosaurs, or was our existence the improbable beneficiary of catastrophic chance? The tension between necessity and accident remains suspended, an unanswered problem embedded in the very fabric of Earth's history.